There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to the English countryside in the early morning, before the birds have properly started and after the last of the night sounds have faded. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of something that has been here for a very long time and has stopped needing to announce itself. The fields stretch out flat and green and indifferent, the hedgerows marking the edges of things in lines that seem entirely natural, until you realize they are not natural at all, that someone put them there, that they follow boundaries drawn up centuries ago by people whose names are mostly gone. If you know what to look for, the fields themselves will tell you things. A slight rise in the ground where there should be no rise. A depression that follows a line too straight to be accidental. A change in the color of the grass in a dry summer. Darker green over the filled-in foundations of a wall. Lighter where the soil was disturbed and never fully settled. These marks in the landscape are not decorative. They are the last physical traces of places where people lived, raised children, buried their dead, argued with their neighbors, and went to church on Sunday mornings for 300 or 400 years before something happened and they stopped. England has more than 3,000 lost villages. This is not a figure from legend or speculation. It is a conservative estimate drawn from decades of systematic archaeological survey, from aerial photography, from the patient work of researchers who have spent careers documenting what is no longer there. 3,000 settlements that appear in medieval records, in the Domesday Book of 1086, in tax records and church registers and manorial accounts, and then disappear, not gradually, not by merging with neighboring towns and growing into something larger, but simply stopping. The last entry in the record. Then, nothing. Some of them have names that survive, even though the places themselves do not. Imber in Wiltshire, Tyneham in Dorset, Wharram Percy in Yorkshire, perhaps the most studied of all the lost medieval villages in England. Its earthworks preserved in a shallow valley on the Yorkshire wolds, the ruined church still standing, the outlines of 200 years of ordinary life still readable in the ground, if you know how to look. Others have lost even their names, known now only by a grid reference on an Ordnance Survey map, a note in a county archaeological record, a brief entry that says something like deserted medieval village and gives no further information, because there is no further information to give. They disappeared for different reasons. This is one of the things that makes the story of England's lost villages more complex and more human than it might at first appear. There was no single catastrophe, no one event that emptied the landscape. There was the plague, which came in 1348 and returned again and again for the next century, taking in some villages half the population and in others everyone. There were the enclosures, the quiet economic violence of landlords who decided that sheep were more profitable than tenants and simply removed the tenants to make room for the sheep. There were the floods and the storms and the shifting coastlines that took coastal settlements into the sea. There were the deliberate clearances of the Norman kings who wanted forests for hunting and simply erased the people who were in the way. There were the reservoirs, built in the 19th and 20th centuries to supply the growing industrial cities of England with water. and filled with the drowned remains of communities that had existed for 800 years. Each of these reasons produced a different kind of disappearance, a different shape of loss, and each of them left something behind in the landscape, some trace, some scar, some silence that is slightly different from the silence of a place where nobody ever lived. You are listening to Histomnia. If this kind of story is something you return to, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps the channel find the people it is made for. Leave a comment if you like, telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. We love knowing who is with us in the quiet hours. Tonight, we are going to visit 10 places. A village in Yorkshire where the last family left sometime in the 15th century, and the grass has been growing over their doorsteps ever since. A coastal city that was once one of the most important ports in England and now lies 60 feet underwater off the Suffolk coast, its church bells still occasionally audible, according to local tradition, in the stillness after a storm. A valley in Wales that was emptied in living memory to fill a reservoir, whose stone walls and chapel foundations appear again above the waterline in dry summers, as if the village is trying to come back. We are going to spend time in these places. We are going to think about the people who lived in them and the various ways they were taken away. And we are going to do all of this slowly, without rushing, in the way that places like this deserve to be thought about. Close your eyes if you like. Let the world around you grow quiet. We begin in Yorkshire, in a shallow valley on the Wolds, where the wind moves through the grass in the same way it has been moving through the grass for 700 years, and where the outline of a village called Wharram Percy is still visible in the ground, waiting to be read by anyone patient enough to look. The village of Wharram Percy sits in a dry valley cut into the chalk of the Yorkshire Wolds, about 6 miles southeast of Malton. It is not easy to find if you do not know where you are going. There is no road sign pointing to it, no car park, no visitor centre with a cafe and a gift shop. There is a footpath across a field, a stile, and then the valley opens up below you, and you see the ruined church of St. Martin standing alone in the grass, its nave roofless, its tower still holding, the churchyard around it full of graves that have not been tended for 500 years. The village that surrounded this church was inhabited from at least the 9th century. By the time of the Domesday Survey in 1086, it was a functioning settlement with 2 manors, a mill, and enough taxable population to be worth recording. It grew through the 12th and 13th centuries, adding houses and a second row of properties along a village green, the layout that was standard across the medieval English Midlands and North. 2 rows of longhouses facing each other across a central space where the animals were kept and the village's common life was conducted. The longhouses at Wharram Percy were not small. Archaeological excavation beginning in the 1950s and continuing for almost 50 years, one of the longest continuous excavations of a single site in British archaeological history, revealed structures that were rebuilt and modified repeatedly over generations, each family adapting the space they had inherited to the needs of the family they were raising. Walls were thickened, doorways were moved. The end of the building that housed the animals was sometimes converted into additional living space as the family grew, and then converted back when the animals needed it again. These were not static places. They were dynamic, lived in, constantly adjusted to the pressures and possibilities of ordinary life. And then, sometime in the late 14th or early 15th century, the adjustments stopped. The precise date at which Wharram Percy was finally abandoned is not recorded in any surviving document, because the kind of people who lived in Wharram Percy were not the kind of people whose departures were noted in writing. What the archaeology shows is a gradual contraction, fewer houses maintained, more left to decay, the church congregation shrinking, until at some point there was nobody left to maintain the fabric of the building, and the roof began to go. By the early 16th century, the village was gone. The church survived a little longer, serving the scattered farms in the surrounding area, before it too was abandoned in the 18th century and left to become what it is now. What happened to the people of Wharram Percy is the question that the archaeology can answer only partially. The plague certainly took some of them. The cemetery at Wharram Percy has been excavated extensively, and the bones it has yielded have told researchers things about medieval health and diet and disease that no document could have provided. But plague alone does not explain the abandonment. Other villages lost as many people to the plague and recovered. What seems to have happened at Wharram Percy, as at hundreds of other villages across the English Midlands and North, is that the plague weakened the community enough that when the economic pressure of enclosure arrived, when the lord of the manor decided that the land was more valuable as sheep pasture than as tenant smallholdings, there was not enough resistance left to push back. The sheep came, the people went. The grass grew over the doorsteps. This is where we begin tonight, in a valley in Yorkshire, where the wind is the same wind that moved through the thatch of those longhouses 700 years ago, and where the silence is the particular silence of a place that was full of life for 5 centuries and has been empty ever since. In the summer of 1348, a ship docked at the port of Melcombe Regis on the Dorset coast, and something came ashore that England had never encountered before. Within weeks, the surrounding villages were losing people faster than they could be buried. Within months, the dying had spread north and east across the country, moving along the roads and the rivers and the coastal trading routes, following the same paths that goods and news and ordinary human contact followed, because it travelled in the bodies of people who did not yet know they were carrying it. By the time the first wave of the Black Death had passed through England, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population was dead. The villages that survived this first wave were not safe. The plague came back in 1361, and again in 1369, and again in 1375, each return taking fewer people than the one before, but taking them nonetheless, wearing down communities that had not had time to fully recover from the previous outbreak. A village that lost 40% of its population in 1348, and then lost another 20% in 1361, was not the same village it had been before. It was a smaller, older, more fragile thing, with fewer hands to work the fields, and fewer children to grow into those hands, and the margin between survival and collapse had become very thin. Some villages crossed that margin and did not come back. The pattern of abandonment that follows the plague years is visible across the Midland counties of England with particular clarity in Leicestershire and Northamptonshire and Warwickshire, where the combination of plague mortality and subsequent enclosure pressure emptied the landscape of settlements that had been continuously inhabited since before the Norman Conquest. Villages that appear in the Domesday Book of 1086 that paid taxes and sent men to war and maintained their churches through 2 centuries of medieval English life simply stop appearing in the records sometime in the late 14th or early 15th century. The last tax assessment, the last mention in a manorial account, then the silence that the fields still hold. What the plague did to individual villages can sometimes be reconstructed from the records that survive, though the records are thinner than historians would like, precisely because the plague killed the people who kept records along with everyone else. In some parishes, the registers of institutions to church livings, the appointments of new priests to replace priests who had died, survive. And these registers tell a story that is almost unbearable to read in detail. A priest dies. His replacement is appointed within weeks. That replacement dies. Another is appointed. That one dies too. In some parishes, this cycle repeated 4 or 5 times within a single year, each new priest arriving to find a congregation that was smaller than the one his predecessor had served. Each one dying before he had time to learn his parishioners' names. The villages associated with these parishes did not always survive the loss of their priests. The church was not only a religious institution in a medieval English village, it was the administrative centre of the community, the place where births and deaths and marriages were recorded, where disputes were sometimes settled, where the rhythms of the agricultural year were marked and sanctioned by ritual. A village without a functioning church was a village that had lost one of the structures that held it together, and some of them, weakened by plague mortality and deprived of this institutional anchor, simply could not hold. Eyam in Derbyshire did not disappear, but its story belongs in this telling because it illustrates, more clearly than almost any other place in England, what a community facing plague actually looked like from the inside. And because the choice its inhabitants made in 1665 sets it apart from every other village touched by the disease. Eyam is a small village in the Peak District, set in a narrow valley between limestone hills, the kind of place that feels enclosed and self-contained in the way that upland English villages often do, turns slightly inward on itself by the geography around it. In the autumn of 1665, a tailor's assistant named George Vickers received a parcel of cloth from London. The cloth was damp from the journey. He spread it out before the fire to dry. Within days he was dead, and within weeks his neighbours were dying too. What happened next at Eyam is one of the strangest and most debated episodes in English social history. The village, led by its rector William Mumperson and a former rector named Thomas Stanley, made a collective decision to quarantine itself. The inhabitants agreed not to leave. They agreed to stay within a boundary marked by stones on the surrounding hills. Some of these boundary stones still exist and can be walked to, and to accept supplies left at these boundaries by people from the surrounding area, in exchange for coins left in water or vinegar to disinfect the payment. The quarantine lasted 14 months. During that time, 260 people died in a village that had perhaps 350 inhabitants at the start of the outbreak. Entire families were wiped out. Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 children within 8 days in August of 1666, digging the graves herself because there was nobody left to help her. Carrying the bodies one by one to a field above the village that is still known as the Riley Graves. Eyam survived. The decision to quarantine almost certainly prevented the plague from spreading further into Derbyshire and beyond. But the village that survived was not the same village that had made the decision 14 months earlier. It was a place that had looked directly at something most communities never have to face, had made a choice that most communities are never asked to make, and had come through the other side into a silence that was different from any silence it had known before. The silence of a village after plague is not the silence of a village that was never inhabited. It contains something that ordinary silence does not contain. The people who walked away from the emptied villages of the 14th century, the survivors who looked back at houses where nobody was left to live and made the calculation that there was nothing to return to, they left something behind that the grass has been slowly covering ever since, and that the archaeology occasionally uncovers. And that sits in the landscape of the English Midlands and North as a kind of weight that most people who walk across those fields never feel and never need to feel. But it is there. It has been there for 700 years. And on a quiet morning, when the light is flat and the birds have not yet started and the fields stretch out in every direction without a building in sight, you can sometimes sense the edge of it, the way you can sometimes sense the edge of a very large thing in the dark without being able to see it. In the next block, we move forward in time by about a century, and we move from catastrophe to something quieter and in some ways more disturbing: the slow, deliberate, entirely legal removal of people from land their families had farmed for generations, to make room for animals that were worth more money. The sheep did not come suddenly. They came gradually, field by field, village by village, across the course of a century, and the people who were moved had almost no recourse and almost no voice in the records that survive. We are going to try to hear them anyway. There is a document in the National Archives dated 1489 that records a complaint brought before Parliament about the state of the English countryside. It describes villages standing empty, houses fallen into ruin, churches without congregations, fields that had once supported dozens of families now given over entirely to sheep. The man who drafted the complaint used language that was, for a parliamentary document of the period, unusually direct. The decay of towns and villages, he wrote, was a thing piteous and horrible to behold. Parliament passed a law in response. The law did very little. What was happening to the English countryside in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was not a natural disaster. and not a plague. It was a business decision made by landlords across the Midland counties of England, repeated thousands of times over the course of a century, each individual instance small enough to seem unremarkable, and the cumulative effect large enough to change the landscape of England permanently. The decision was always roughly the same. Arable land, land that had been farmed in strips by tenant families for generations, producing grain and vegetables and the basic substance of rural life, was more valuable, the landlords calculated, if it was converted to sheep pasture. Wool prices were high. The Flemish and Italian cloth merchants who bought English wool paid well for it, and the profit from a flock of sheep on enclosed pasture was significantly greater than the rent that could be extracted from tenant farmers working the same land in the traditional open field system. The tenants were in the way. The legal mechanisms for removing them were well established and had been used for other purposes for centuries. The landlord simply declined to renew the leases of his tenants when they expired, or found technical grounds to terminate them early, or in some cases simply informed the tenants that they were to leave and left it at that, relying on the practical reality that a poor family in a tied cottage had very limited ability to contest the decision of the man who owned both the cottage and the land around it. The houses were sometimes demolished immediately to prevent the former tenants from returning. Sometimes they were simply left to decay, which they did quickly once the people who had maintained them were gone, the roofs going first, then the walls following over the course of a generation or two, until nothing remained above ground level. The sheep moved in. The grass grew. The village disappeared. The man whose name is most associated with documenting this process was John Rose, a chantry priest from Warwickshire, who spent much of his adult life in the second half of the 15th century compiling a list of the settlements in his county that had been destroyed by enclosure. His list, which survives in several manuscript versions and has been studied by historians of the period in considerable detail, names 58 villages and hamlets in Warwickshire alone that had been depopulated within his own memory or within living memory of the people he spoke to. 58 settlements in one county within roughly a century. Roos was not a dispassionate chronicler. He was angry. His descriptions of individual enclosures have a specificity and an indignation that distinguish them from the more measured language of official records. He names the landlords responsible. He records how many families were displaced from each village, how many houses were pulled down, how many acres of arable land were converted to pasture. He notes the names of villages where the church still stood, because the landlord had not yet got around to demolishing it, standing alone in the middle of a sheep pasture with no congregation to fill it. He notes the cases where former villagers had appealed to the courts and lost, where they had petitioned the king and received no response, where they had simply walked away because there was nothing else to do. One of the villages Roos documented was a place called Compton Verney in Warwickshire, depopulated sometime in the 1470s to create a deer park for the Verney family. The deer park survives. It is now the grounds of an art gallery. The village it replaced has left traces in the landscape that are still visible to anyone who knows what they are looking at. A series of low earthwork humps, and hollows in the grass around the gallery buildings, the ghostly imprint of streets and house platforms and garden enclosures, preserved by the same accident of land use that has preserved so many of the lost villages of the English Midlands. The fact that once land is converted to permanent pasturage is rarely ploughed again, and the earthworks beneath the grass remain intact for centuries. The people of Compton Verney left no record of their departure. Their names do not appear in any document that has survived. What survives is the shape of the place they lived in, pressed into the soil by 700 years of English weather, and the knowledge that one day in the 1470s they packed whatever they could carry and walked away from houses their families had occupied for generations, because a man who owned the land had decided that deer were more valuable than they were. The scale of what happened across England during this period is difficult to grasp in the abstract. The historian Maurice Beresford, who did more than anyone else in the 20th century to document the lost villages of England, estimated that somewhere between a third and a half of all the deserted medieval villages identified in England were depopulated at least partly as a result of enclosure. In the Midland counties, Leicestershire, Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, the proportion was higher. These were the counties where the open field system had been most fully developed, where the conversion to sheep pasture was most economically attractive, and where the landscape today still carries the evidence of what was lost in the gentle undulations of fields that look, to the untrained eye, simply like fields. There were people who resisted. Not many, and not effectively, but some. In 1516, a commission was established to investigate enclosures and report on the damage done, and its findings document cases where former tenants had returned to their destroyed villages and attempted to rebuild, where they had ploughed up the sheep pasture and replanted their strips, where they had confronted the landlord's agents physically and been removed by force. These acts of resistance were almost always unsuccessful. The law was on the side of the landlord in most cases, or at least sufficiently ambiguous that the landlord could use it more effectively than the tenant could. But they happened. People who had nothing to gain from resistance, except the act of resistance itself, who knew they were likely to lose and resisted anyway, because the alternative was to walk away without saying anything at all about what had been taken from them. Most of them walked away without saying anything. The records do not preserve what they felt about this. The records preserve the legal transactions, the court proceedings, the parliamentary complaints, the lists compiled by angry priests. What the records do not preserve is the experience of being the last family in a village, of watching the houses on either side of yours fall empty and decay, of knowing that the life your parents had lived and their parents before them was ending not because of plague or flood or any act of God, but because of a calculation about the price of wool. The grass grew over it. The sheep grazed on top of it, and the landscape of the English Midlands, which looks from a distance like the most settled and permanent thing in the world, carries underneath its surface the memory of everything that was cleared away to make it look like that. In the next block, we leave the inland counties and walk east to the Suffolk coast, to a place where the loss was not gradual and economic, but sudden and absolute. where an entire city was taken not by plague or landlords, but by the sea, and where on quiet days, according to the people who have lived near it for generations, you can still hear the bells of the drowned churches ringing underneath the water. In the year 1250, Dunwich was one of the most important ports in England. This is not a local boast or a piece of regional mythology inflated by the passage of time. It is a statement supported by the administrative records of medieval England, which showed Dunwich paying taxes at a level comparable to the cities of Norwich and York, maintaining a fleet of ships significant enough to contribute vessels to royal naval campaigns, and supporting a population of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people, a substantial town by the standards of medieval England, with 8 parish churches, 2 monasteries, a Franciscan friary, a Templar commandery, a hospital, a market, and all the institutional infrastructure of a functioning medieval city. By 1300, half of it was gone. By 1400, most of what remained of the half that had survived was also gone. By the 20th century, the last church had fallen into the sea. Its tower went over the cliff edge in 1919, the final piece of a city that had been disappearing for 7 centuries, dropping at last into the water that had been taking everything else since the storms of the 13th century began their work. What happened to Dunwich was not a single catastrophe, though the storms of 1286 and 1328 were catastrophic enough individually. It was a process, slow, and then fast, and then slow again, driven by the particular dynamics of the Suffolk coastline, which is made not of chalk or hard rock, but of soft glacial deposits, sand and gravel and compressed clay, that the North Sea has been eroding for thousands of years and will continue to erode long after the last trace of the medieval city has disappeared. The coastline at Dunwich retreats by roughly a metre every year on average, and has been retreating at roughly this rate for as long as anyone has been measuring it, which means that the cliff edge today is in a completely different place from where it was when the first settlers built their houses on what must have seemed, to people without any long view of geological time, like solid and permanent ground. The storms of the late 13th century accelerated what was already happening. The Great Storm of 1286 drove enormous quantities of sand and shingle into the mouth of the harbour that was Dunwich's reason for existing, blocking it so effectively that ships could no longer enter, and the trade that had made the town wealthy began immediately to decline. The storm of 1328 was worse. It destroyed in a single night a significant portion of the town that remained, taking houses and streets and at least one complete parish church into the water, and depositing so much material at the harbour mouth that the blockage became essentially permanent. The ships went to other ports. The merchants followed. The population that had no economic reason to remain began to leave. What makes Dunwich unusual among the lost places of England is that its disappearance was not invisible. It happened in front of people. Generation after generation of Dunwich inhabitants watched the cliff come closer, watched the streets at the edge of the town become the streets at the edge of nothing, watched the church of St. Leonard go over in the 14th century, and the church of St. Martin in the 15th, and St. Nicholas, and St. Peter after that, each one standing at the cliff edge for some years before the ground beneath it finally gave way, the tower cracking, and then leaning, and then falling in sections into the water below. The town kept records of its own diminishment with a persistence that is almost difficult to understand from the outside. The Corporation of Dunwich, which continued to function as a legal entity long after the town it governed, had shrunk to a handful of houses, maintained its records, held its elections, sent its representatives to Parliament. Dunwich was a parliamentary borough until the Reform Act of 1832, and documented the losses with the careful attention of people who had not yet accepted that what was happening was permanent. The records note the loss of each church with the same administrative tone as the records of new appointments and tax assessments. St. Leonard's gone, St. Martin's gone, St. Nicholas gone. The language does not change even as the subject matter becomes progressively more catastrophic. There is something almost admirable about this persistence, and something almost heartbreaking. The people of Dunwich kept governing a city that was disappearing beneath the waves, kept writing down what they were losing, kept sending members to Parliament from a borough that by the 18th century consisted of a few dozen inhabitants and a stretch of cliff that was getting shorter every year. They did not give up. They simply ran out of town. The bells are the part of the Dunwich story that has travelled furthest from the original facts and into the territory of legend. But the legend is worth examining, because it tells you something about what the loss of Dunwich meant to the people who witnessed it and to the people who came after. The claim, repeated in local histories, in travel writing, in the accounts of visitors to the Suffolk coast across several centuries, is that on certain days, when the sea is calm and the wind is in the right direction, the bells of the drowned churches can be heard ringing beneath the water. This is not literally true. The bells went into the sea along with everything else, and bells submerged in 60 feet of cold North Sea water do not ring. The physical mechanism does not exist, but the persistence of the story across so many centuries and so many independent tellings suggests that it is true in a different sense, that people standing on the beach at Dunwich, looking out at the grey water that covers what was once a city, have consistently found themselves hearing something, or feeling something, or reaching for the idea of sound as the best way to describe the particular quality of absence that the place produces in the people who stand at its edge. Divers who have worked the Dunwich site in recent decades have found the physical remains of the medieval city preserved in the silt of the seabed with a clarity that the erosion of the cliff edge might lead you not to expect. The foundations of churches, the outlines of streets, gravestones, some of them still upright, the inscriptions worn but sometimes still legible. The names of people who were buried in the churchyard of a church that no longer exists, in a city that no longer exists, on a piece of land that is now 60 feet below the surface of the North Sea. The gravestones are perhaps the strangest detail. A graveyard on the floor of the sea, the dead of a medieval English city lying where they were put 700 years ago. The ground above them gone, the church above them gone, the city above them gone, but the graves themselves still there, still in their rows, the stones still marking what was once a specific and meaningful place and is now simply a coordinate on a nautical chart. Dunwich is still there. It is just not where it used to be. On a clear day, you can stand on the beach at Dunwich and look out at the water and see nothing. The surface gives no indication of what is underneath it. The sea is the sea, indifferent and continuous. The same water that took the harbour in 1286 and the churches in the 14th and 15th centuries and the last tower in 1919. The same water that is taking the cliff behind you at roughly a metre a year and will continue to take it long after you have gone. Listen, if you like. There is nothing to hear but the water, but people have been listening here for 700 years, and they keep hearing something. Perhaps that is enough. In the next block, we move from the sea to the reservoir, from a loss that happened across centuries to a loss that happened within living memory, to places that were emptied not by nature or by economic calculation, but by a deliberate decision made by distant authorities who needed water for distant cities, and who looked at a valley with a village in it and saw a reservoir with a village in the way. In 1955, the inhabitants of Capel Celyn in the Tryweryn Valley in North Wales received a notice informing them that their village was to be flooded. The Tryweryn River was to be dammed. The valley was to be filled with water. The water was to supply the city of Liverpool, which needed more of it than its existing sources could provide. The village, which had existed in that valley for centuries, which had a chapel and a post office and a school and a community of Welsh-speaking farming families who had lived there for generations, was in the way of the reservoir. The notice gave them several years to make arrangements. The people of Capel Celyn did not accept this quietly. They organized. They petitioned. They sent delegations to Parliament. Every single member of the Welsh local authorities who was consulted on the matter voted against the scheme. Every Welsh member of Parliament opposed it. The opposition was unanimous, articulate, and ultimately irrelevant, because the Liverpool Corporation Bill that authorised the flooding of the valley was passed by the Westminster Parliament in 1957, and the votes of Welsh representatives were not sufficient to stop it. The last family left Capel Celyn in 1965. The valley was flooded in 1966. The reservoir, named Llyn Celyn, was opened by the Queen in 1967. A councillor from Liverpool, speaking at a public meeting in Wales during the controversy, said that Liverpool could not be expected to go thirsty for sentimental reasons. The drowning of Capel Celyn became, in Wales, something larger than the loss of a single village. It became a symbol of a relationship between Wales and England that many Welsh people had long felt, but that the destruction of a living Welsh-speaking community for the benefit of an English city made impossible to ignore. The incident contributed directly to the growth of Welsh nationalist sentiment in the 1960s and beyond. And the slogan painted on walls across Wales in the years following the flooding, Cofidge Tryweryn, remember Tryweryn, is still painted on walls in Wales today, still visible on a famous stretch of wall near Llanrwystad that has been repainted every time it fades or is defaced for more than 50 years. But Capel Celyn was not the first Welsh village to be drowned for a reservoir, and it was not the first English one either. The history of the English and Welsh reservoir villages spans roughly a century, from the 1870s to the 1960s, and it follows the growth of the industrial cities of the English Midlands and the North with a grim consistency. Birmingham needed water, Manchester needed water, Liverpool needed water, Sheffield, Bradford, Leicester, all of them needed more water than their local sources could supply, as their populations grew through the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th. And the solution that the engineers and the municipal authorities settled on was consistently the same. Find a valley in the uplands, build a dam, fill the valley with water, pipe the water to the city. The valleys that were chosen because they were suitable for engineering reasons. The right geology, the right gradient, sufficient rainfall catchment. They were also, in many cases, chosen because the people who lived in them were poor and Welsh or poor and rural English, and the political cost of displacing them was calculated to be lower than the political cost of displacing people who had more power to resist. The village of Nantgyrthen on the Len Peninsula in Wales was cleared for a different reason. Not a reservoir but the quarrying industry, but the pattern of its emptying follows the same logic. The village of Mardale Green in Cumbria was drowned in 1935 to create Horsewater Reservoir for Manchester. The inhabitants were given compensation and relocation assistance and told that their church would be demolished before the valley was flooded, which it was. The stones used to build a filter house for the new reservoir. The bodies in the churchyard were exhumed and reburied on higher ground. In very dry summers, when the water level in Horsewater drops far enough, Mardale Green comes back. This is the detail that has caught the imagination of everyone who has written about the drowned villages of England since it first happened, because it reverses the expected direction of things. The village was supposed to be gone. The water was supposed to have covered it permanently. But in the drought of 1976, and again in 1984, and again in more recent dry years, the water level dropped enough to expose the foundations of the old village, the walls of the farmhouses, the bridge over the beck, the outline of the lanes that connected the houses to each other and to the road that used to run down the valley before the valley ceased to exist. People drive to Horsewater in dry summers to see it. They stand at the edge of the water and look out at the stone walls rising from the reservoir and the lanes that lead nowhere now, that end at the waterline where the rest of the village is still submerged. Local walkers who knew the valley before it was flooded have described the experience of seeing it re-emerge as profoundly disorienting. The landscape of their memory suddenly presents again in 3 dimensions after decades of existing only in recollection. The village is not there. Exactly. What is there is the skeleton of the village, the hard parts that the water preserved rather than destroyed. The stone that resisted 60 years of submersion better than the wood and the plaster and the thatch and the glass and all the soft materials of inhabited life. The farmhouses are walls without roofs. The lanes are outlines without surfaces. The church is a foundation without a building. But the geometry of the place is intact. The relationship between the houses, the way the lanes connect them, the position of the bridge, all of it's still there. Still readable, still recognizably the village it was before 1935. The people who lived there are not there. They took their furniture and their livestock and the contents of their houses when they left, and the personal things, the photographs, the letters, the objects that carried the meaning of specific lives, went with them, dispersed across the farms and houses they moved to, eventually inherited by children and grandchildren who may or may not have kept them, eventually lost in the ordinary attrition of objects over generations. What the reservoir preserved was the architecture. What it could not preserve was the life. There is a particular cruelty to the drowned village that is different from the cruelty of plague depopulation or enclosure clearance. Plague and enclosure left the physical fabric of the village intact, at least initially. The houses stood empty and decayed slowly. The churches remained. The fields kept their shapes. The reservoir takes the physical fabric too. It takes the buildings and the lanes and the churchyard and the view from the kitchen window and the sound of the water in the beck on a rainy night, and it puts 60 feet of cold water over all of it. And the city gets its water, and the valley gets its silence, and the people who were told to leave take with them only what they can carry. In Capel, Celyn in Wales, in a drought year, the tops of the chapel walls sometimes appear above the waterline of Celyn. People come to look at them the way people come to look at the walls of Mardale Green, standing at the water's edge, looking out at the stones that are visible and thinking about the stones that are not, trying to reconstruct in imagination the place that the water covers and the community that the water replaced. The Welsh word for longing for a place, for the particular grief of being away from a home you cannot return to, is hiraeth. It does not translate exactly into English. The closest equivalents, homesickness, nostalgia, are too mild, too recoverable. Hiraeth implies something more permanent, a longing for something that is gone and will not come back, a grief that is not acute but chronic, that sits in the body rather than the mind, that is felt most strongly in the presence of the landscape of the lost place, if that landscape can still be reached, or in the absence of it, if it cannot. The people who stood at the edge of Celyn in the drought of a dry summer and watched the chapel walls appear above the water knew something about hiraeth that does not require translation. In the next block, we leave the reservoirs and go back further in time to the Norman kings who came to England in 1066 and remade the landscape in ways that are still visible today, including the creation of vast hunting forests that required the removal of everyone who was already living there. We are going to talk about what it meant to be in the way of a king who wanted deer, and about the particular shape of erasure that royal power produces when it decides that a piece of land is more valuable empty than inhabited. In the autumn of 1066, William of Normandy won a battle near Hastings and became, by right of conquest, the King of England. What this meant in practice for the people of England was a change of ruling class so complete and so rapid that it has no real parallel in English history before or since. Within 20 years of the conquest, almost every significant landholding in England had changed hands. The Anglo-Saxon thegns who had owned the land, who had farmed it and administered it, and passed it to their children for generations, were gone, dead in the wars of the conquest, dispossessed by legal mechanisms that the new Norman aristocracy controlled entirely, or reduced to a subordinate status so complete that it amounted to erasure. In their place were Norman lords who spoke a different language, followed different customs, and had a different relationship to the English landscape than the people they had replaced. One expression of this different relationship was the royal forest. The word forest in this context does not mean what it means today. A royal forest was not necessarily wooded, though some of it was. It was a legal designation, a territory placed under forest law, a separate body of law that existed outside the common law of England and that had one primary purpose, which was to protect the deer and the habitat of the deer for the hunting pleasure of the king and such lords as the king chose to permit to hunt there. Forest law regulated what could be done within the designated territory with an intrusiveness that touched every aspect of the lives of the people who lived there. You could not clear woodland without a license. You could not graze animals in certain areas. You could not build without permission. You could not kill any animal that the forest law designated as a beast of the chase, which included not only deer, but also wild boar, hares, and the wolves that still existed in parts of England in the 11th and 12th centuries. The penalties for violating forest law were, in the early Norman period, extreme. Killing a deer in a royal forest was punishable by blinding and castration under William the Conqueror. Later kings moderated this to heavy fines and imprisonment. But the financial penalties remained severe enough to ruin a peasant family, and the forest courts that enforced them were separate from the common law courts and had a reputation for partiality that the people who appeared before them found well deserved. The New Forest in Hampshire was the first and most notorious of William's hunting grounds, and the creation of it in 1079 produced a loss that the chroniclers of the period recorded with an unusually explicit moral judgment. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was not given to editorial comment, noted that William loved the tall deer as if he were their father, and that he made great protection for them, and that the rich complained and the poor lamented, but he was so hard that he recked not the hatred of them all. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, records the names of the villages within the New Forest that were emptied to create it: Canterton, Francheville, Godwinston, Ratchapit, Ralvington, Tatchbury. These names appear in the Domesday record as places that once existed and no longer do, their inhabitants relocated, their houses cleared, their fields given over to the deer that the king valued more than the people. The number of villages cleared for the New Forest has been debated by historians for a long time, and the estimates range from a handful to several dozen, depending on how you define a village and how you interpret the Domesday evidence. What is not debated is that people were moved. that communities that had existed on that land before the conquest were removed from it after the conquest, and that the reason for their removal was that a king wanted to ride his horse through the Hampshire countryside and shoot deer without encountering the inconvenience of inhabited settlements. The people who were displaced from the New Forest villages did not disappear. They were relocated to the edges of the forest or to other lands that the king assigned to them. Or they found their own way to other communities and absorbed themselves into existing settlements. They were not killed. The conquest had already done a great deal of killing, and William was not, in this instance, pursuing a policy of extermination. He was pursuing a policy of clearance, which is a different thing, and which leaves a different kind of trace in both the landscape and the historical record. The trace in the landscape is still there. The New Forest today is one of the largest areas of unenclosed land in southern England, a mosaic of ancient woodland and open heath and bog that has been managed in various ways for nearly 1,000 years. The ponies that graze on the open heath are descended from animals that have been grazing there since the medieval period. The deer are still there, protected now not by forest law, but by the management practices of the Forestry Commission and the National Park Authority. The landscape looks, to a modern visitor, like a piece of wild England that has survived somehow in the midst of a densely populated and heavily developed region. It is not wild. It is a managed landscape, and the management of it began with an act of royal power that cleared the people who were living there and replaced them with deer. The heath that looks natural is the result of centuries of grazing by the animals that the forest law protected. The woodland that looks ancient is ancient, but its character has been shaped by the same grazing pressure, the same pattern of management, the same absence of the ploughing and the building and the clearing that would have transformed it if the villages had stayed. The absence of those villages is written into the landscape in ways that are difficult to see because they are absences rather than presences. You cannot point to a mound or an earthwork and say here is where a village was, the way you can at Wharram Percy or the deserted villages of the English Midlands, because the New Forest was managed as forest land continuously from the 11th century. And the traces of the pre-conquest settlements have been obscured by 1,000 years of different land use. What you can do is read the Domesday Book and find the names of the places that were there before 1079 and are not there now, and stand in the forest and know that somewhere under the heath and the oak trees and the centuries of accumulated leaf mold, the foundations of those places still exist, waiting for the kind of patient excavation that has not yet been done. Other royal forests followed the New Forest across the 12th and 13th centuries as the Norman and Angevin kings extended the system of forest law across an ever larger proportion of England. At its peak, in the reign of Henry II in the late 12th century, perhaps a third of the entire land area of England was under forest law in some form. This did not mean that a third of England was emptied of people. Forest law was applied with varying intensity in different areas, and in many forests, the existing inhabitants were allowed to remain under conditions that restricted what they could do with the land. But in the areas of most intensive royal interest, the pattern of the new forest was repeated. Communities displaced, land cleared, deer introduced, the landscape reorganized around the preferences of a king who spent perhaps a few weeks a year in each of his hunting grounds, and whose pleasure required the permanent reorganization of the lives of the people who lived there year-round. The resentment this produced was real and lasting. The forest law provisions of Magna Carta in 1215, the clauses demanding that the extent of the royal forests be reduced and that forest law be reformed, were among the most insistently demanded concessions in the negotiations between King John and his barons, and they reflected not only baronial self-interest, but a broader popular feeling about the injustice of a legal system that protected deer at the expense of people. The forests were gradually reduced in extent over the following 2 centuries. The most oppressive provisions of forest law were softened, but the villages that had been cleared in 1079 were not rebuilt, and the people whose ancestors had been displaced were not returned to the land their families had once farmed. The deer grazed on. The forest grew around them, and the names in the Domesday Book, Canterton, Francheville, Godwinstoun, remained as names without places, attached to nothing but the record of what had once been there before a king decided he wanted the land for something else. In the next block, we climb above the landscape and look down at it from the air, because it was only from the air, in the 20th century, that the full extent of what England had lost became visible for the first time, and the fields that had seemed simply to be fields revealed themselves as something much stranger and more haunted than anyone standing in them had been able to see. In the summer of 1945, a Royal Air Force pilot named Arnold Baker was flying over the English Midlands on a training exercise when he noticed something in the fields below him that he had not expected to see. The summer had been dry, and the crops were showing the effects of the drought in a way that made certain patterns in the ground visible from the air that were invisible from the ground. Darker strips of growth where the soil was deeper, lighter patches where it was thin, lines and rectangles and curves that did not correspond to any current field boundary or road or drainage ditch. That seemed to belong to a different map entirely, one drawn at a different time by people who had organized the landscape according to principles that no longer applied. Baker was not an archaeologist, but he recognized that what he was seeing was significant, and he took photographs. What he had found was not new exactly. Aerial photography had been used by archaeologists since the 1920s, and the principle that crop marks reveal buried features had been understood since the First World War, when pilots photographing enemy positions from the air noticed that the sites of ancient settlements and earthworks were sometimes visible as patterns in the vegetation below them. But the systematic application of aerial photography to the study of the English landscape, the deliberate and sustained effort to fly over the country in dry summers and photograph everything that the crops were revealing, was still in its early stages in 1945. And what Baker and the archaeologists who followed him in the post-war decades found when they looked at the English Midlands from the air was staggering in its extent. The lost villages were everywhere, not the earthwork sites that had already been identified by ground survey, the places where the mounds and hollows were obvious enough to be noticed by anyone walking across them. Those had been known about, in a general way, for centuries. What the aerial photography revealed were the sites where there were no earthworks, where centuries of ploughing had leveled the surface of the ground until it appeared completely flat and featureless, but where the buried foundations of houses and the filled-in ditches of village streets and the compacted soil of medieval lanes still affected the growth of whatever was planted above them in ways that became visible from the air in the right conditions. A buried stone wall, 2 or 3 feet beneath the surface of a ploughed field, produces a strip of thin, dry soil directly above it. In a dry summer, the crop growing above that strip is stressed before the crop on either side of it, and it ripens earlier and turns a lighter color. From above, in the right light, at the right time of year, this lighter strip is visible against the darker background of the surrounding crop. And because medieval buildings had walls that formed rectangles, and because medieval streets were straight or gently curved, and because medieval field systems had their own geometries, the patterns that emerged from the aerial photographs were not random. They were the plans of villages, house plots, streets, the outline of a church, a village green, the whole settlement invisible from the ground, legible from 500 feet as clearly as if someone had drawn it on the field in chalk. The man who did the most to systematize what the aerial photography was revealing was Maurice Beresford, a historian at the University of Leeds, whose 1954 book, The Lost Villages of England, established the study of deserted medieval villages as a serious academic discipline, and gave the people who worked in it a name and a methodology, and, perhaps most importantly, a sense of the scale of what they were dealing with. Beresford combined the aerial photographic evidence with systematic research in the documentary record, cross-referencing the sites identified from the air with the mentions of settlements in medieval tax records, church registers, and manorial accounts, and building up a picture of the lost settlement pattern of medieval England that was, when it was first published, genuinely shocking in its implications. There were not dozens of lost villages. There were not hundreds. There were thousands. Beresford's initial estimate of around 1,300 deserted medieval village sites in England has been revised upward significantly by subsequent research, and the current figure recognized by the Deserted Medieval Village Research Group, which was established in 1952 and has been cataloguing sites ever since, stands at well over 3,000. 3,000 settlements that appear in the historical record before the 15th or 16th century and do not appear after it, each of them leaving some trace in the landscape that the aerial photographers have been systematically recording since the 1940s. The traces vary in their legibility. Some sites, like Wharram Percy, have earthworks so well preserved that the plan of the village is readable from the ground without any need for aerial photography. Every house platform and hollow way and garden enclosure still visible as a distinct feature in the grass. Others survive only as crop marks, legible from the air in a dry summer and invisible at every other time. Others again are known only from documents, their physical remains so thoroughly destroyed by by subsequent ploughing or building that nothing remains above or below the surface that the current state of archaeological technology can detect. What the aerial photography made possible for the first time was a view of England as a palimpsest, a surface that had been written on and erased and written on again, with each layer of writing leaving traces that the next layer could obscure but not entirely remove. The fields of the English Midlands, seen from 500 feet in the right conditions, are not simply fields. They are a record of every use the land has been put to since people first began to modify it. And the modifications of the medieval period, the ridge and furrow of the open field system, the house platforms of the deserted villages, the hollow ways of the lanes that connected them, are among the most legible layers of that record, preserved in the topography and the soil chemistry of a landscape that has been, in many parts of England, under permanent grass since the enclosures of the 15th and 16th centuries removed the plough. Ridge and furrow is perhaps the most widespread of these traces, and worth understanding because it is visible across enormous areas of the English Midlands, even from the ground, lending a characteristic corrugated appearance to old pasture fields that is so common in certain counties that it is easy to mistake it for a natural feature of the landscape. It is not natural. It is the physical record of medieval ploughing, the accumulated result of centuries of turning the soil with a heavy plough that threw the earth to one side, building up over generations a series of raised ridges separated by lower furrows, the whole system oriented to aid drainage and to mark the boundaries between the strips that different tenants farmed in the open field system. When the open fields were enclosed and converted to pasture, the ploughing stopped. The ridges and furrows were no longer disturbed. The grass grew over them and held them in place, and they have been held in place ever since by the roots of the turf that covers them, preserved in the landscape with a fidelity that means that a field in Northamptonshire or Leicestershire or Warwickshire that has been under permanent grass since the 16th century will still show, to anyone who looks at it in the right light, the exact pattern of the strips that medieval peasants farmed, the precise width of each strip reflecting the distance that a plough team could turn in a day, the orientation of the ridges reflecting the direction that the ploughing ran. This is what the fields remember, not in any metaphorical sense, but literally, physically, in the chemistry of the soil and the shape of the ground, in the patterns that drought stress makes visible in crops, and that low winter sunlight makes visible in old pasture. The medieval landscape of England has not gone. It is present everywhere, underneath everything, written into the ground in a language that took 5,000 years of aerial photography to learn to read. The archaeologists who have spent careers reading this language speak about it with a particular kind of quietness that is different from the excitement of a new discovery or the satisfaction of a solved problem. It is the quietness of people who have spent a long time in the presence of something very large, who have slowly understood the scale of what is there, and have found that the understanding produces not triumph, but a kind of humility. The landscape is bigger than they are. It has been here longer than they have. It will be here after they are gone. carrying its record of everything that has happened on it, waiting for the next generation of people patient enough to look. In the next block, we come down from the air and back to the ground, and we focus in on the smallest possible scale, not the pattern of an entire village seen from 500 feet, but a single person, the last inhabitant of a place that everyone else has already left. We are going to think about what it means to be the last one, to stay when everyone else has gone, and about the particular kind of courage or stubbornness or love of place that produces this kind of person in every generation and every culture that has ever had to leave somewhere behind. In 1943, the British War Office sent letters to the inhabitants of the village of Eyam in Dorset, informing them that their village was required for military training purposes and that they were to vacate their homes by the 26th of November. The letter assured them that they would be able to return when the war was over. A notice pinned to the door of the village church by the last inhabitants as they left read, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us have lived for generations to help win the war to keep men free. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating the village kindly." They did not return. The War Office retained the land after the war ended, and it remains part of a military training range to this day. The village of Eyam stands empty inside the range, its houses roofless, its church preserved as a small museum, accessible to visitors on weekends and public holidays when the military is not using the surrounding land. The notice on the church door is gone, but a copy of it is displayed inside, and people who visit the village read it and stand for a moment in the silence of the nave before going back out into the churchyard, where the graves of the families who lived there are still maintained, the grass kept short, the headstones still upright. The people of Eyam were given 6 weeks' notice. This was not unusual. The histories of the cleared and drowned and emptied villages of England are full of notices and letters and official communications informing people that the place they lived was needed for something else and that they were to be somewhere else by a specified date. The tone of these communications varies across the centuries, from the blunt directives of Norman forest officials to the bureaucratic courtesy of 20th century government letters. But the essential content is always the same. You are here. You need to be elsewhere. The date by which this must be accomplished is as follows. What the notices do not record, because notices are not designed to record such things, is what happened in the houses and the lanes and the fields of the affected villages in the weeks between the receipt of the notice and the departure of the last inhabitant, the sorting through of possessions accumulated over generations, the decisions about what could be carried and what would have to be left, the conversations between neighbors who had lived next to each other for their entire lives and were now going to different places, the last services in the church, the last market day, the last time the school bell rang and the children came out into the lane and went home to houses that would be empty within the week. In some cases, these final days were documented, usually by outsiders, journalists, local historians, photographers who came to record what was about to be lost. The photographs taken in the days before the flooding of Capel Celyn in Wales show a village in the process of being unmade. Furniture stacked in yards waiting to be loaded onto carts. Windows already removed from some houses. The chapel stripped of its fittings. The gravestones in the churchyard tagged for exhumation and reburial on higher ground. The people in the photographs look at the camera with expressions that are difficult to categorize, that contain elements of grief and dignity, and a kind of flat endurance that comes from having to do something that cannot be undone. But the documented departures are the minority. Most of the villages that emptied over the course of English history did so without anyone coming to photograph or record the process, and the last days of those communities exist only in memory, passed down through families as stories that became less specific with each generation until they were reduced to a few details. A grandmother who refused to leave until the last possible moment. A chest that had to be abandoned because it was too heavy to carry. A dog that kept returning to the old house after the family had moved. These fragments are all that survive of the experience of departure for most of the people who went through it, and they survive only in the families that came from those villages, and only for as long as those families maintain the thread of the story. The people who refuse to leave are a distinct category, and they appear with a consistency across the different types of village loss that suggests something real about human attachment to place. In the enclosure clearances of the 15th and 16th centuries, the court records include cases of tenants who refused to vacate their houses after their leases were terminated, who had to be physically removed by the landlord's agents, who returned after removal and had to be removed again. In the reservoir clearances of the 19th and 20th centuries, there are accounts of elderly people who agreed to move, but who returned repeatedly to the site of their former homes, standing at the edge of the rising water and watching the familiar landscape disappear beneath it. In Mardale Green in Cumbria, the village that was drowned to create Horsewater Reservoir in 1935. The last farmer to leave was a man named John Home, whose family had farmed in the valley for generations. He stayed until the water was almost at his door. The account of his departure that has survived in local records describes him driving his sheep up the fellside above the valley, the flock moving ahead of him in the early morning light, the farmhouse already beginning to disappear below the rising waterline as he reached the ridge and looked back down at the valley that his family had worked for as long as anyone could remember. He did not go back. There was nothing to go back to. The stubbornness of the last inhabitants is sometimes read as heroism, and sometimes as a failure to accept reality, and probably it was neither of these things in most cases, but simply the expression of an attachment to place that is so fundamental to human experience that it resists even the most compelling practical arguments for leaving. The house you grew up in is not just a building. The field you have farmed for 30 years is not just a piece of ground. The view from the kitchen window is not just a view. These things have accumulated meaning through years of daily contact until they are woven into the texture of a person's sense of themselves in a way that cannot be separated out and packed into a box and moved somewhere else. This is what the people who wrote the notices and the letters and the parliamentary bills were asking people to separate from themselves. Not just a house, not just land. The specific and irreplaceable texture of a life lived in a particular place, among particular people, in a landscape that had been modified by the presence of their families for generations, and that bore, in its fields and its hedgerows and its lanes, the evidence of everything their predecessors had done there. You cannot compensate someone for the loss of that. The relocation payments offered to the inhabitants of Capel, Celyn, and Mardale Green, and Tyneham, and the dozens of other English and Welsh villages cleared in the 20th century, were not nothing. They provided the material means to establish a new life somewhere else, but they were compensation for the measurable losses, the house and the farm and the income. And the measurable losses were not the only losses, and in many cases not even the most significant ones. What could not be compensated was the loss of the specific place itself, the particular quality of the light in that valley in the early morning, the sound of that specific stream running over those specific stones, the way the hill looked from the doorstep in every season across a lifetime of doorstep mornings. These things are not transferable. They belong to the place, and when the place is gone, they are gone with it, and no amount of money and no quality of alternative accommodation changes that fact. The last inhabitants of the lost villages of England carried this knowledge with them when they left. Some of them talked about it, most did not, because it is the kind of loss that is difficult to articulate to people who have not experienced it, and because the people who had the power to help them had already demonstrated, by the act of clearing them, that they did not consider this kind of loss to be something that required their attention. They went to wherever they went. They built new lives, as people do, because people are adaptable, and because the alternative to building a new life is worse. They had children and grandchildren who grew up somewhere else, and for whom the lost village was a story their grandparents told, becoming less vivid with each retelling as the people who had been there became fewer and the distance from the event grew larger. And in the landscape where they had lived, the grass grew, or the water rose, or the sheep moved in, or the military fenced the perimeter and put up warning signs, and the place continued to exist in its altered form, carrying in its soil and its stones the record of everything that had happened there, waiting with the patience of landscape for the next person patient enough to look. In the next block, we turn from loss to something more unexpected, the villages that came back, the settlements that disappeared, and then, in various ways and for various reasons, found their way back into existence, sometimes in the same place and sometimes nearby, sometimes with the same name and sometimes with a new one. And what this improbable recovery tells us about the persistence of human attachment to particular places across even the longest and most definitive seeming absences. In 1943, the British War Office sent letters to the inhabitants of the village of Tyneham in Dorset, informing them that their village was required for military training purposes, and that they were to vacate their homes by the 26th of November. The letter assured them that they would be able to return when the war was over. A notice pinned to the door of the village church by the last inhabitants as they left read, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us have lived for generations to help win the war to keep men free. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating the village kindly. They did not return. The War Office retained the land after the war ended, and it remains part of a military training range to this day. The village of Tyneham stands empty inside the range, its houses roofless, its church preserved as a small museum, accessible to visitors on weekends and public holidays when the military is not using the surrounding land. The notice on the church door is gone, but a copy of it is displayed inside, and people who visit the village read it and stand for a moment in the silence of the nave before going back out into the churchyard, where the graves of the families who lived there are still maintained, the grass kept short, the headstones still upright. The people of Tyneham were given 6 weeks' notice. This was not unusual. The histories of the cleared and drowned and emptied villages of England are full of notices and letters and official communications informing people that the place they lived was needed for something else, and that they were to be somewhere else by a specified date. The tone of these communications varies across the centuries, from the blunt directives of Norman forest officials to the bureaucratic courtesy of 20th century government letters. But the essential content is always the same. You are here. You need to be elsewhere. The date by which this must be accomplished is as follows. What the notices do not record, because notices are not designed to record such things, is what happened in the houses and the lanes and the fields of the affected villages in the weeks between the receipt of the notice and the departure of the last inhabitant, the sorting through of possessions accumulated over generations, the decisions about what could be carried and what would have to be left, the conversations between neighbors who had lived next to each other for their entire lives and were now going to different places, the last services in the church, the last market day, the last time the school bell rang and the children came out into the lane and went home to houses that would be empty within the week. In some cases, these final days were documented, usually by outsiders, journalists, local historians, photographers who came to record what was about to be lost. The photographs taken in the days before the flooding of Capel Celyn in Wales show a village in the process of being unmade, furniture stacked in yards waiting to be loaded onto carts, windows already removed from some houses, the chapel stripped of its fittings, the gravestones in the churchyard tagged for exhumation and reburial on higher ground. The people in the photographs look at the camera with expressions that are difficult to categorize, that contain elements of grief and dignity, and a kind of flat endurance that comes from having to do something that cannot be undone. But the documented departures are the minority. Most of the villages that emptied over the course of English history did so without anyone coming to photograph or record the process, and the last days of those communities exist only in memory, passed down through families as stories that became less specific with each generation, until they were reduced to a few details. A grandmother who refused to leave until the last possible moment. A chest that had to be abandoned because it was too heavy to carry. A dog that kept returning to the old house after the family had moved. These fragments are all that survive of the experience of departure for most of the people who went through it, and they survive only in the families that came from those villages, and only for as long as those families maintain the thread of the story. The people who refuse to leave are a distinct category, and they appear with a consistency across the different types of village loss that suggests something real about human attachment to place. In the enclosure clearances of the 15th and 16th centuries, the court records include cases of tenants who refused to vacate their houses after their leases were terminated, who had to be physically removed by the landlord's agents, who returned after removal and had to be removed again. In the reservoir clearances of the 19th and 20th centuries, there are accounts of elderly people who agreed to move, but who returned repeatedly to the site of their former homes, standing at the edge of the rising water and watching the familiar landscape disappear beneath it. In Mardale Green in Cumbria, the village that was drowned to create Horsewater Reservoir in 1935. The last farmer to leave was a man named John Home, whose family had farmed in the valley for generations. He stayed until the water was almost at his door. The account of his departure that has survived in local records describes him driving his sheep up the fellside above the valley, the flock moving ahead of him in the early morning light, the farmhouse already beginning to disappear below the rising waterline as he reached the ridge and looked back down at the valley that his family had worked for as long as anyone could remember. He did not go back. There was nothing to go back to. The stubbornness of the last inhabitants is sometimes read as heroism, and sometimes as a failure to accept reality, and probably it was neither of these things in most cases, but simply the expression of an attachment to place that is so fundamental to human experience that it resists even the most compelling practical arguments for leaving. The house you grew up in is not just a building. The field you have farmed for 30 years is not just a piece of ground. The view from the kitchen window is not just a view. These things have accumulated meaning through years of daily contact until they are woven into the texture of a person's sense of themselves in a way that cannot be separated out and packed into a box and moved somewhere else. This is what the people who wrote the notices and the letters and the parliamentary bills were asking people to separate from themselves. Not just a house, not just land. The specific and irreplaceable texture of a life lived in a particular place, among particular people, in a landscape that had been modified by the presence of their families for generations, and that bore, in its fields and its hedgerows and its lanes, the evidence of everything their predecessors had done there. You cannot compensate someone for the loss of that. The relocation payments offered to the inhabitants of Capel, Celyn, and Mardale Green, and Tyneham, and the dozens of other English and Welsh villages cleared in the 20th century were not nothing. They provided the material means to establish a new life somewhere else, but they were compensation for the measurable losses, the house and the farm and the income. And the measurable losses were not the only losses, and in many cases not even the most significant ones. What could not be compensated was the loss of the specific place itself, the particular quality of the light in that valley in the early morning, the sound of that specific stream running over those specific stones, the way the hill looked from the doorstep in every season across a lifetime of doorstep mornings. These things are not transferable. They belong to the place, and when the place is gone, they are gone with it, and no amount of money and no quality of alternative accommodation changes that fact. The last inhabitants of the lost villages of England carried this knowledge with them when they left. Some of them talked about it, most did not, because it is the kind of loss that is difficult to articulate to people who have not experienced it, and because the people who had the power to help them had already demonstrated by the act of clearing them that they did not consider this kind of loss to be something that required their attention. They went to wherever they went. They built new lives, as people do, because people are adaptable, and because the alternative to building a new life is worse. They had children and grandchildren who grew up somewhere else, and for whom the lost village was a story their grandparents told, becoming less vivid with each retelling as the people who had been there became fewer and the distance from the event grew larger. And in the landscape where they had lived, the grass grew, or the water rose, or the sheep moved in, or the military fenced the perimeter and put up warning signs, and the place continued to exist in its altered form, carrying in its soil and its stones the record of everything that had happened there, waiting with the patience of landscape for the next person patient enough to look. In the next block, we turn from loss to something more unexpected: the villages that came back, the settlements that disappeared, and then, in various ways and for various reasons, found their way back into existence, sometimes in the same place and sometimes nearby, sometimes with the same name and sometimes with a new one. And what this improbable recovery tells us about the persistence of human attachment to particular places across even the longest and most definitive seeming absences. In 1978, a group of Welsh language activists purchased the village of Nant Gwrtheuyn on the Leicestershire Peninsula in North Wales for the sum of £25,000. The village had been empty since 1959, when the last inhabitants of the quarrying community that had lived there for a century and a half finally left. And in the nearly 20 years of its abandonment, it had deteriorated to the point where several of the stone cottages had lost their roofs, and the track leading down the steep hillside to the village from the road above had become impassable to vehicles. The activists who bought it had a specific purpose in mind. They wanted to create a Welsh language centre, a place where people could come to learn Welsh and to immerse themselves in the language in an environment removed from the pressures and distractions of ordinary life. Nant Gwrtheuyn, isolated at the bottom of a cliff on a remote peninsula, accessible only by a single steep track, seemed to offer exactly the kind of removed and concentrated environment they were looking for. They spent the next decade restoring the cottages, repairing the track, installing the infrastructure that a functioning educational centre required, and gradually transforming a derelict and empty village into a living community for the first time in 20 years. The centre that opened in the 1980s has been operating ever since, teaching Welsh to thousands of students from Wales and from the wider world. And the village of Nant Gwrtheuyn, which had been emptied by the decline of the quarrying industry and had seemed destined to decay quietly into the hillside, is now one of the most visited places on the Len Peninsula. The village came back, not as what it had been, not as a quarrying community, not with the same families, not with the same daily rhythms of industrial work and chapel going, and the particular social life of a close-knit community at the bottom of a cliff, but as something with people in it, with purpose and activity and the sound of voices, with lights in the cottage windows at night and smoke from the chimneys in winter. The physical fabric of the place, which had survived the abandonment better than might have been expected, because the stone construction of the cottages was robust, and the isolation of the site had protected it from the vandalism and salvage that emptied so many other abandoned villages of their materials, turned out to be sufficient to support a new kind of inhabitation. Nant Gurthen is an unusual case, and it is worth being clear about what makes it unusual. The return of a community to an abandoned village is not a common event. The forces that empty villages, economic decline, enclosure, plague, flooding, military requisition, are in most cases permanent in their effects, or permanent enough that no reversal occurs within any time frame that means anything to the people who were displaced. The drowned villages do not come back, except as exposed ruins in drought years. The plague villages do not repopulate. The enclosed villages do not get their tenants returned to them. But the pattern of what happens to abandoned settlements over very long periods of time is more complex than a simple story of loss and permanence suggests, and there are cases across the long history of English settlement where places that were emptied in one period became inhabited again in another, sometimes carrying the old name and sometimes acquiring a new one, sometimes in the same location and sometimes nearby. The process is most visible in the archaeology of the very early medieval period, before the Norman Conquest, when the pattern of settlement across England was still fluid in ways that it ceased to be once the landscape had been more thoroughly organized by manorial administration and church structures. Villages moved. They shifted their location by a few hundred meters over the course of a century or two, leaving the earthworks of the earlier settlement visible in a field next to the current village, close enough to suggest continuity of community even when the physical location had changed. In some cases, this movement can be tracked through the documentary record. In others, it can only be inferred from the archaeology. But the broader pattern is clear enough that archaeologists have given it a name, village drift, and have identified it as a normal feature of early medieval settlement rather than an exceptional one. What this means in practical terms is that some of the deserted medieval villages identified by aerial photography and ground survey are not the simple casualties of plague or enclosure that they appear to be. Some of them are earlier phases of settlements that still exist. The abandoned earthworks in the field next to a living village, representing not a separate lost community, but an earlier location of the same community, the place where the same families lived before they moved 2 fields to the north, sometime in the 12th century, for reasons that are no longer recoverable from the available evidence. The continuity in these cases is not in the place, but in the people, or rather in the community, the network of families and relationships and shared practices and local knowledge that constitutes a village as a social entity, which can survive a change of physical location in a way that the physical location itself cannot survive a change of community. When the people of Wharram Percy left their village in the 15th century, they went somewhere. They did not cease to exist. Their descendants are alive today, dispersed across England and beyond, carrying in their genes and perhaps in fragments of family memory the inheritance of a community that farmed a particular valley in Yorkshire for 5 centuries and then moved on. This dispersal is not a return, but it is a kind of continuation, and it is worth holding alongside the stories of loss that this video has been telling, as a reminder that loss and continuation are not opposites, that the same event can be both at once, that the emptying of a village is a catastrophe for the community as a community while being, for the individuals who survive it, the beginning of something else rather than simply the end of what was. Eyam, which we visited in the second block of this video, offers perhaps the most striking example of what a community can survive and still remain a community. 2/3 of its population died in 14 months. The survivors did not leave. They stayed in the village that the quarantine had held together and that the plague had devastated, and they rebuilt the social fabric of the place around the diminished number of people who remained. And Eyam continued as a living village and continues today. A small community in the Peak District that is aware of its history in the way that places which have been through extraordinary things are sometimes aware of their history, carrying it not as a burden, but as a kind of identity. The village of Imber in Wiltshire, cleared by the War Office in 1943 for tank training at roughly the same time as Tyneham in Dorset, has not been returned to civilian habitation and shows no sign of being returned. But it is open to visitors on certain days each year, and on those days former inhabitants and their descendants return to the village and walk its streets and enter the Church of St. Giles, which has been maintained by the military in a state of reasonable preservation, and hold a service in the building where their families worshipped before the War Office needed the land. This annual return is not the return of the village. The village is still empty. The houses are still used for military training and are in various states of deliberate decay, their windows broken, their interiors used to practice the techniques of urban warfare. But the annual gathering of the descendants of Imber's former inhabitants in the Church of St. Giles is a return of something, of the community to the place, if only for a day, of the connection between the people and the specific ground they came from, which has not been severed by 80 years of absence, as completely as the War Office's continued possession of the land might suggest. There is a theory in the anthropology of place attachment that argues that the connection between a community and a specific location is not simply a matter of living there, that it is built up over generations through the accumulation of shared experience and shared memory and shared practice in relation to a particular piece of ground, and that this accumulated connection does not dissolve immediately when the community is displaced, but persists in attenuated form through the memories of the displaced people and through the stories they tell their children and grandchildren about the place they came from. By this theory, the village of Capel, Celyn in Wales has not entirely ceased to exist. even though it is under 60 feet of water and has been for 60 years. It exists in the memories of the people who were alive when it was cleared and who are still alive today, and in the stories that those people have told and are still telling, and in the activism and the political sentiment that the clearance generated and that has not dissipated in the decades since. Cofuge Trywerin, remember Trywerin. The instruction to remember is itself a form of continuation, a refusal to allow the lost to become complete by allowing it to become forgotten. The villages that came back did so because enough people remembered them clearly enough and cared about them persistently enough to do the work of restoration. Nant Gurthin came back because a group of people decided that what it had been and what it could be again were worth the effort of 20 years of restoration work. The annual gathering at Imber persists because the descendants of its former inhabitants have chosen to maintain the connection across the generations that separate them from the village their grandparents knew. Memory is not a passive thing. It is maintained by choice, by the repeated decision to remember, to tell the story again, to go back if going back is possible, and to hold the place in mind if it is not. The villages of England that have not come back are not simply forgotten. They are remembered by the people who study them, and the people who descend from them, and the people who stand in the fields above their earthworks and feel, in the particular quality of the silence there, something that is not quite explainable, but is not nothing either. They are held in the landscape itself, in the shapes the ground makes, in the patterns the crops make in dry summers, in the stones under the water of the reservoir, and the foundations under the heath of the New Forest, and the names in the Domesday Book that belong to places no one can visit anymore. They are held there, and they wait, with the patience of things that have been waiting for a very long time, and have learned not to be in a hurry about it. In the final block, we come back to the beginning, to the fields, to the silence, to the question of what it means to walk across a landscape that carries so much of what has been lost, and what we owe to the places that held the lives of the people who came before us, and then to sleep.